Her family sold her to a circus for being too tall, until a quiet strongman brought her home. You hear stories, don't you, about the Dust Bowl days, about folks so hard up they'd do things that would turn your stomach now. Things that make you shake your head and thank God you live in a different time. This is one of them stories. It ain't pretty. It ain't polished. It's just how it was told to me, passed down like a worn-out coat. It's about a girl who committed the terrible sin of growing. She just kept going up, a weed in a field of daisies, her head getting closer to the sun while everyone else stayed rooted to the hard-packed dirt. Her family, they were dirt-poor farmers, and every inch she grew was another mouth to feed, another yard of cloth they didn't have. They looked at her not like a daughter, but like a blight on their crops. Her own pa, a man who should have protected her, saw her height and didn't see a miracle. He saw a commodity, a freak. And freaks, well, freaks could be sold. So he did. The day the circus came to town, a grimy traveling show with peeling paint on the wagons and animals that looked half-starved, her pa saw his chance. He took her by the arm, her bony wrist lost in his calloused hand, and he marched her right up to the ringmaster. The man had a greasy mustache and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked her up and down, this girl who was already near 6 feet tall and not even a woman yet, and he named a price. It wasn't much. A handful of silver dollars, enough to buy seed for the spring and maybe a new pair of boots. The price of a good mule. That's what she was worth. Her pa took the coins without looking at her. The silence from him was the loudest sound she'd ever heard. Louder than the circus music. Louder than the roar of the mangy lion in its cage. It was a silence that confirmed everything she already feared. She wasn't family. She was a burden, a thing to be sold. They put her in a cage, not all the time, just for the show. They dressed her in a ridiculous outfit, all stripes and ruffles meant to make her look even more like a clown, a caricature. The ringmaster would stand outside the bars with his long whip, not to hit her, but to point. "Behold," he'd yell, his voice echoing in the dusty tent, "the Goliath girl, straight from the mountains of Patagonia, a giantess among mortals." The crowd would gasp and gawk. They'd point. Children would laugh. Some would cry. Men would make crude jokes. Women would whisper behind their hands a mix of pity and disgust. And she would just stand there. Her world had shrunk to the size of that cage. The smell of sawdust and sweat and unwashed bodies. The pain wasn't from the bars. It was from the eyes. 1,000 eyes on her every single day, stripping her down to nothing but her height. She learned to be silent. Utterly, completely silent. Words were useless. They couldn't make her shorter. They couldn't take her home. Home wasn't even a place she could picture anymore. It was just the memory of a closing door and her father's back as he walked away. She learned the rhythms of the circus. The jolting of the wagon at night. The taste of stale bread and thin soup. The ache in her bones from sleeping curled up in spaces too small for her long limbs. The sun felt different, harsher. The dust was a permanent part of her, in her throat, under her fingernails. A constant gritty reminder of where she was. There was no kindness, not a drop. The other performers, the bearded lady and the fire eater and the acrobats, they had their own miseries. They saw her as just another part of the show, another freak in the lineup. She was alone, a tall, silent island in a sea of noise and cruelty. The ringmaster, a man named Fletcher, he was the worst. He saw the flicker of life in her eyes and made it his mission to snuff it out. He'd taunt her, call her names, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey. He never hit her where it would show. A bruise would mar the spectacle. But his words were lashes, and his presence was a constant suffocating threat. She felt herself disappearing, not shrinking, but fading, turning into the thing they said she was. Just a creature in a cage, a spectacle of bone and skin, waiting for the show to end so she could retreat back into her silence. That was her life. Day in, day out. The dust, the sweat, the pain, the silence. A living ghost, haunting the edges of a cheap, forgotten circus. That's where the story really begins. Not with her being sold, but in the heart of that despair, where you reckon there ain't no hope left at all. This story is just getting started, and I'm so glad you're here for it. If you're enjoying the journey so far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. And I'd love to know where you're all watching from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Now, let's get back to it. There was a man who traveled with the circus, but he wasn't really of the circus. His name was Silas. He was the strongman, but not the kind that performed in the ring, all oiled up and flexing for the crowd. He was the other kind, the working kind, the one who drove the enormous stakes into the ground with a sledgehammer to raise the big top, the one who hauled the cages and loaded the wagons. He was a quiet man, a mountain of a man, with shoulders as wide as a barn door and hands that could palm a melon. He never spoke much, never smiled. His face was a landscape of grim lines, his eyes a flat, unreadable gray, like a winter sky. He did his work, collected his pay, and kept to himself in a small tent pitched away from the main camp. The other carnies gave him a wide berth. They said he had a temper, that he'd killed a man in a bar fight down south, but nobody knew for sure. He was a ghost of a different sort, a ghost of pure brute force content to be left alone. He saw the girl. Of course he saw her. He was the one who had to haul her cage on and off the wagon every day. He'd see her inside, standing still as a statue, her eyes fixed on some distant point nobody else could see. He never gawked. He never spoke to her. He'd just do his job, his movements efficient and powerful. He'd grunt with the effort of lifting the heavy iron, the muscles in his back cording like thick rope. He'd feel the vibration of the ground as he drove the stakes, and sometimes he'd look over and see her flinch just a little at the percussive boom. He saw the way Fletcher, the ringmaster, looked at her, that greasy, possessive leer. He saw the way the crowd stripped her bare with their stares. He didn't think much of it. It wasn't his business. Nothing was his business except the hammer, the ropes, and the road. His life was a simple, brutal equation of effort and exhaustion. He had made a pact with himself a long time ago. Don't get involved. Trouble finds you when you get involved. He'd had enough trouble for one lifetime. But then came a night in a mud-soaked town in the middle of nowhere. The show had been a disaster. The rain had turned the ground to soup. The crowd was small and mean, and Fletcher had been drinking more than usual. After the last of the disappointed townsfolk had trudged away, Fletcher stormed over to the girl's cage. He was in a rage, blaming her for the poor turnout. "Useless freak," he slurred, rattling the bars. "Can't even draw a decent crowd. You're costing me money, you giant cow." The girl, as usual, said nothing. She just stood there, her long frame rigid, her face a pale mask in the lantern light. That seemed to make Fletcher even madder. He fumbled at his belt and pulled out a short, thick cane he used for pointing. "Maybe you need a reminder of who owns you," he hissed, unlatching the cage door. Silas was nearby, coiling a thick rope. He was supposed to be deaf to this stuff. He was supposed to turn his back. It wasn't his business. He kept telling himself that. Not his business. Not his fight. But he didn't turn away. He watched Fletcher step into the cage, the cane raised. He saw the girl's hands clench into fists at her sides, the only sign of the storm raging inside her. And something in Silas broke. A wire that had been stretched taut for years finally snapped. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just dropped the rope and walked over. He moved with a quiet, deliberate weight, his heavy boots making soft sucking sounds in the mud. He filled the entrance of the cage, blocking the lantern light, plunging the small space into shadow. Fletcher spun around, startled. "What do you want, Silas? This ain't your concern." Silas didn't answer. He just looked at the cane in Fletcher's hand. Then he reached out, his massive calloused hand engulfing Fletcher's fist. There was no struggle. It was like a child trying to resist a blacksmith. Silas simply squeezed, a slow, immense pressure, until Fletcher cried out and his fingers went limp. The cane dropped into the mud. Silas bent down, picked it up, and with a single fluid motion he snapped it over his knee. The crack was sharp and final. He tossed the two pieces aside. Then he looked at the girl. Her eyes, wide in the gloom, were fixed on him. For the first time, he saw something in them other than despair. Surprise, fear, a flicker of something else. He gave a short, almost imperceptible jerk of his head toward the open cage door. It wasn't a question. It was a command. A quiet, unspoken invitation. "Come." She hesitated for only a second. Then she unfolded her long limbs and stepped out of the cage, out into the muddy, rain-soaked night. Silas turned and started walking away from the circus tents, away from the noise and the lights, without a word, without looking back to see if she was following. He could hear her footsteps, long and steady, falling into rhythm with his own. He led her away from the circus grounds, through the sleeping, muddy town, and out onto a dirt track that wound its way into the low, dark hills. He didn't live with the others. He had a place of his own, a small, ramshackle cabin he'd taken over, a relic from some failed homesteader. It was about a mile out, isolated and quiet, just the way he liked it. The walk was silent. The only sounds were their footsteps and the chirping of crickets. He didn't offer her his coat, though the night was getting cold. He didn't try to make conversation. He just walked, a dark shape moving through the night, and she followed, a taller, thinner shadow right behind him. The cabin was just one room built of rough-hewn logs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a simple cot was pushed against the other. There was a crude table, 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding tins of food, and some worn-out books. It was stark, it was spare, but it was clean. And, most importantly, it was quiet. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and pine, not sweat and sawdust. Silas lit a kerosene lamp, the flame chasing the shadows into the corners. He didn't look at her. He moved around the small space with a familiar economy of motion. He pointed a thick finger at the hearth. "Fire," he grunted. Then he pointed to a wooden bucket of water and a tin basin on a washstand. Water. It wasn't a welcome. It was a statement of facts. Here are the things you need for basic survival. He went to the shelves and took down a can of beans and a slab of salted pork. He began preparing a meal, his back to her, slicing the pork with a large knife and dumping it all into a cast-iron pot that he hung over the fire he'd just started. The girl, Alara, though he didn't know her name, she just stood by the door, dripping onto the floorboards. She looked like a lost animal, unsure of what to do, where to stand. She was used to cages and commands, and this quiet, neutral space was alien territory. She watched him work, watched the methodical way he stirred the pot, the firelight catching the hard planes of his face. He wasn't looking at her, wasn't demanding anything of her. He was just being. Finally, she moved. She went to the basin, poured some water, and washed her face and hands. The water was cold, but it felt good, washing away the grime and the grease paint of the circus. When the stew was ready, a thick, bubbling concoction that smelled rich and savory, Silas ladled it into 2 tin bowls. He set them on the table, sat down in one of the chairs, and began to eat without a word. He didn't invite her to join him. He just left the other bowl there. For a long moment, she just stared at it. It had been so long since someone had shared a meal with her without it being a transaction, a begrudging handout. Slowly, she walked to the table and sat in the other chair. The chair was too small for her. Her knees were nearly up to her chin, but she didn't care. She picked up the spoon and took a bite. It was hot. It was salty. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against tin and the crackle of the fire. When he was done, Silas took his bowl to the washstand. As he passed her, he saw it, a dark, ugly welt rising on her arm where Fletcher had grabbed her, and the raw, red chafe marks on her neck and shoulders from that ridiculous, scratchy costume. He stopped. He went to a small wooden chest in the corner and took out a small, round tin. He walked back to the table and set it down in front of her. Salve. He didn't say what it was for. He didn't need to. He just put it there and walked away, going outside to check on something, giving her the privacy to tend to her own wounds. She sat there, staring at the small tin. It was a simple, practical gesture, an act of care stripped of all sentimentality. It wasn't pity, it was acknowledgement. He saw her hurt and he offered a solution, that was all. But it was more than she had received from anyone in a very long time. She picked up the tin. It was cool in her hand. A small, solid anchor in a world that had been nothing but chaos. In the quiet of that cabin, with the smell of stew and wood smoke in the air, she felt a seed of something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, not yet, but a kind of stillness, the first night of safety. They fell into a routine, a silent dance of cohabitation. He would rise before the sun, stoke the fire, and head out to do whatever work he found on the edges of town, mending fences, clearing stumps, things that required his strength and didn't require much talk. She would stay at the cabin. At first she did nothing, just sat in the chair, watching the fire, as if she was afraid to move, afraid to take up space. But slowly she began to inhabit the silence. She swept the floor. She washed the 2 bowls and the 2 spoons. She learned the rhythms of the cabin, the way the sun moved across the floorboards, the sound of the wind in the pines outside. They rarely spoke. A grunt from him, a nod from her. Their communication was in actions. He would leave a stack of firewood by the door. She would have the water bucket filled when he returned. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He brought back a torn shirt one day, and she, remembering the mending skills her mother had taught her so long ago, found a needle and thread in the wooden chest and repaired it. She left it folded on his cot. He never mentioned it, but the next time he wore it, the seam was straight and strong. Their pasts were like ghosts in the room, present but unacknowledged. His was in the stark emptiness of the cabin, in the way he never spoke of family, in the palpable aura of loneliness that clung to him like his own shadow. Hers was in the way she still flinched at sudden movements, in the permanent sadness in her eyes, in the way she ate her food quickly, as if afraid it would be taken away. One evening, they were sitting by the fire, the way they did most nights. He was sharpening his axe on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, 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 a familiar, comforting sound. She was watching the flames, her long fingers steepled under her chin. His eyes strayed to the window, and he looked out at the hill behind the cabin. It was barely visible in the twilight, but he knew what was there. He stopped sharpening the axe. The silence that fell was different, heavier. He saw her looking at him, then at the window, then back at him. She knew. She must have seen them. He set the axe down. "My wife," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse. "And my 2 boys. Went quick, fever. Nothing I could do, just dug the holes." He didn't look at her as he spoke. He stared into the fire, as if the memory was playing out in the flames. He told it flat, a simple recounting of facts. No tears, no anger, no self-pity, just the bald, brutal truth. He had built this wall of silence around himself on a foundation of 3 graves. He was a fortress with nothing left inside to protect. The story hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. She didn't say anything comforting. What could she say? She just listened. And in her listening, he felt a strange sense of unburdening. A few nights later, the roles were reversed. He was mending a piece of tack, his big hands surprisingly deft with the needle and all. She had been quiet all day, more so than usual. He could feel a tension coming off her in waves. Then, she spoke. Her voice was soft, hesitant, like a bird testing its wings after a storm. "He wasn't my real pa," she said. He kept his eyes on his work, giving her the space to talk. "My real pa died when I was small. This one, he married my ma. He never liked me. Said I ate too much, said I was unnatural." She told him about the farm, about being treated like a hired hand, not a daughter. She told him about the other kids taunting her, calling her beanpole, giraffe. She told him about her mother, who just watched, who was too scared of her new husband to stand up for her own child. And then she told him about the day of the sale, not the circus part, the part before, the way her stepfather had grabbed her, the look in his eyes. "He said I was a monster," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He said the circus was where monsters belonged. My ma, she just turned her back. She just went inside and closed the door." It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a confession, a sharing of a wound. She was explaining her own ghosts, her own set of graves. The grave of her childhood, the grave of a mother's love. When she finished, the cabin was silent again, but it was a different silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with their shared pain, a rough-hewn bridge built between 2 lonely souls. The quiet rhythm they had found was bound to be broken. The world doesn't leave people alone for long. The first threat didn't come from the circus or the town. It came from the sky. The clouds started gathering in the late afternoon, dark and bruised-looking. The air grew heavy, thick, and still. Silas came back early from a job, his face grim. "Big storm coming," he announced. It was one of the longest sentences he'd spoken to her. He set about securing the cabin, banking the fire, checking the latch on the door. She watched him, then started helping, bringing in the last of the firewood, filling every bucket and pot with water from the well. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. The storm hit just after dark. It wasn't just rain. It was a living thing, a roaring, screaming beast of wind and water. The wind howled like a predator, shaking the small cabin in its teeth. Rain came down in sheets, so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the walls. Thunder cracked right overhead, a sound so violent it felt like the sky was splitting apart. Lightning lit up the room in stark, terrifying flashes. In one of those flashes they saw it, a dark stain spreading on the ceiling. The old roof had sprung a leak. A drip started, then another. A steady trickle of cold, muddy water began to fall, right over the small cot where she slept. Silas swore, a short, sharp sound. He grabbed a bucket and shoved it under the leak. But it was getting worse. The trickle was becoming a stream. The roof groaned under the assault. He dragged the heavy table under the leak, climbed on top trying to see the damage. Too dark, too high. Can't reach, he grunted, frustrated. She was there beside him. Without a word, she pointed at the table. He got down. She climbed up. Her head nearly brushed the rafters. Her long arms, which she had always seen as a curse, could easily reach the leaking spot. He handed her a bundle of old rags. She took them and, with a surprising strength, began stuffing them into the crack in the roof, wedging them between the wooden slats. He stood below, holding the lantern high, directing the light. The wind shrieked. A piece of the roof tore loose outside, clattering away into the darkness. She didn't flinch. She just kept working, her face a mask of concentration. A team. Him, the solid, unmoving base. Her, the long, graceful reach. They were two parts of a whole, working in perfect, unspoken sync against the fury of the storm. For hours they fought it. The bucket filled, he'd empty it, and put it back. She'd call down in a low voice when a new leak started, and he'd direct her to it. It was a desperate, raw battle for their small patch of shelter. In the heart of that chaos, something shifted. They weren't just two strangers hiding from the world anymore. They were partners, a raw, survivalist unity forged in the heat of the moment. When the storm finally began to subside, its rage spent, they were both soaked and exhausted. The floor was a mess of muddy water and discarded rags. But the roof was holding. The cabin was still standing. She climbed down from the table, her legs unsteady. He was standing there. He looked at her wet, matted hair, and her dirt-streaked face. He reached out not to touch her, but he took one of the rags and gently wiped a smudge of mud from her cheek. It was a small, unconscious gesture, a moment of shared victory. They had faced the threat together, and they had won. The storm passed, and the sun rose on a world washed clean. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was layered, deeper. The shared struggle against the storm had woven a new thread into the fabric of their strange life, a thread of reliance. They had seen what the other was made of. He had seen her calm strength, her resilience. She had seen his steadfastness, his refusal to break. The bond between them deepened, not through words, but through the silent language of shared space and common effort. A few days later, Silas was out back, splitting logs for the winter. It was a rhythmic, powerful task he'd done 1,000 times. Swing, thud, crack. He was lost in the motion, but metal fatigues. Wood gets old. On a downswing, the head of the axe, worn loose from its handle, flew off. It spun through the air like a deadly discus, whistling past where Alara was hanging laundry on a line, and embedded itself deep into a fence post with a sickening thwack. Silas froze, the now useless handle still in his hands. His blood ran cold. He stared at the axe head, then at her. She hadn't moved. She hadn't screamed. She just stood there, looking at the quivering axe head buried in the wood just inches from where her head had been. A lesser person would have collapsed, or shrieked, or run. She just slowly turned, her eyes meeting his. She saw the shock and fear on his face, a raw emotion he rarely showed. Then she calmly walked over to the fence post. She wrapped her long, strong fingers around the axe head, and with a steady pull, worked it free from the wood. She walked back to him and held it out. Her hand was perfectly steady. Her face was calm. In that moment, she wasn't a victim he had rescued. She was his equal. He took the axe head from her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, electric. He looked from the heavy piece of iron to her face. He saw no fear, no accusation, only a deep, quiet understanding. He gave a short, sharp nod, a thank you, an apology, a recognition of her strength. It was all there in that one simple gesture. Later that week, he came home leading a horse. It was a wild thing, a rangy Mustang with fire in its eyes and a coat the color of dried mud. He'd been leaving out feed for it for weeks, trying to gentle it, but the horse would have none of it. It reared and pulled against the rope, its nostrils flared, its ears pinned back. Damn thing's got the devil in him, Silas muttered, struggling to hold on. Ilara came out of the cabin and stood on the porch watching. The horse saw her, this tall, strange figure, and went even wilder, pulling so hard Silas nearly lost his footing. "Get back inside," he grunted. "You're spooking him." But she didn't move. She came down the steps, moving slowly, deliberately. She didn't approach the horse's head. She walked in a wide, calm circle, letting it see her from all sides. She started to hum, a low, tuneless sound, the same way her real father used to calm the livestock on their old farm. The horse stopped pulling. It stood watching her, its body still tense, but its eyes curious. She kept humming, getting closer, step by slow step. Silas stood perfectly still, holding the rope, amazed. She reached the horse. She didn't try to pat its head or its nose. She reached out her long, graceful arm and laid her hand flat on its powerful shoulder. She just rested it there, a point of contact, a bridge. She kept humming, her low voice a soothing vibration. The horse trembled, but it didn't pull away. Slowly, its ears unpinned, its head lowered. A long, shuddering breath escaped its lungs. It stood, quiet and accepting, under her hand. Silas stared. He was a man of brute force. He gentled things through strength and persistence. He broke them down. She was different. She didn't break things. She soothed them. She understood their wildness because she had a wildness of her own, a quiet, resilient spirit that had refused to be tamed by a cage. He looked at her then, her tall frame standing next to the powerful animal, and he didn't see a freak or a giantess. He saw something rare and beautiful, a woman as strong as a stone, with a spirit as patient as fire, and a gentleness that could tame the wildest of hearts. Sooner or later, they had to go to town. The tins on the shelves were getting empty, and Silas needed to buy flour, salt, and coffee. He knew what it would mean. He knew the looks they would get. He considered going alone, leaving her at the cabin where she was safe. But when he picked up the empty flour sack, she was standing by the door, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't say anything, but her eyes did. "I'm going with you." It wasn't a question. He just nodded. The town was a small, dusty collection of clapboard buildings baking under a harsh sun. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and anything out of the ordinary was a source of suspicion and gossip. Their arrival was like dropping a stone into a still pond. The ripples started immediately. As they walked down the main street, windows twitched. People stopped what they were doing to stare. First, they saw him, the big silent man who kept to himself. Then they saw her, walking a few steps behind him. Her head held high, her height making her an instant spectacle. The whispers followed them like a cloud of flies. "Look at the size of her. That's the freak from the circus, ain't it?" Heard Silas ran off with her. "What's a decent man want with a thing like that?" The words were crude, meant to be overheard. They were stones thrown from a safe distance. Ilara's face remained impassive, but Silas could see her shoulders tense, her long fingers clenching and unclenching at her sides. He wanted to turn, to glare them all into silence with the force of his presence, but he knew it would only make things worse. So he just kept walking, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The worst of it was in the general store. The proprietor, a weaselly man named Henderson with small, beady eyes, watched them come in, a smirk already on his face. He ignored Ilara completely, acting as if she were a piece of furniture Silas had brought with him. "Silas," he said, his voice oily. "Running low on supplies, are we? Must be hard, feeding too." He leaned over the counter conspiratorially. "Heard you took on a partner." He flicked his eyes over to Alara and back. Silas just placed his list on the counter. Flour, salt, coffee, lard. Henderson chuckled, a nasty grating sound. He began gathering the items, making a show of it. When he got the big sack of flour, he hefted it with a groan. "Gonna need the big one, I reckon," he said, loud enough for the other customers in the store to hear. "Freak like that probably eats twice what a normal woman does. Gonna cost you, Silas. That kind of appetite ain't cheap." The other customers snickered. Alara stood by the door, silent as a stone, but Silas could feel her humiliation like a physical blow. He felt a hot surge of rage, a familiar fire he had spent years banking. He wanted to reach across that counter and shut Henderson's mouth for good, but he fought it down. Violence here would solve nothing. It would only prove them right, so he did the only thing he could. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his worn leather pouch, and counted out the coins onto the counter. He didn't haggle. He didn't argue. He just paid. He looked Henderson dead in the eye, his own gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones. The smirk on Henderson's face faltered. Silas slung the heavy sack of flour over his shoulder, as if it were nothing, grabbed the other supplies, and turned to leave. He didn't say a word. His silence was a wall, a judgment. He walked out of the store, and Alara followed him, the whispers and laughter of the townsfolk at their backs. As they walked back toward the hills, the silence between them was thick with unspoken things. He had protected her, not with his fists, but with his quiet dignity. He had absorbed the venom of the town, taken it on himself, and refused to let it touch her. It was a different kind of strength, and in its own way it was more powerful than any punch he could have thrown. The town's venom wasn't done with them. Word travels fast in small places, and it travels even faster when it's carried on the back of a grudge. Fletcher, the ringmaster, hadn't forgotten the humiliation Silas had dealt him. Losing his prize Goliath girl was a blow to his wallet, but losing her to his own quiet, surly strongman was a blow to his pride, and that was something he couldn't abide. He'd been nursing his anger, letting it fester. When he heard that Silas and the girl had been seen in town, he saw his chance for revenge and for an audience. They were just about to leave the edge of town, where the last of the sad-looking houses gave way to open country, when 3 figures stepped out from behind the blacksmith shop, blocking their path. It was Fletcher, his greasy mustache twitching, and 2 of his burliest roustabouts, men who earned their keep through intimidation and muscle. "Well, well," Fletcher said, a theatrical sneer on his face. "Look what we have here, the runaway monster and her keeper." A few townsfolk, sensing a confrontation, began to gather at a safe distance, eager for the drama. Henderson, the shopkeeper, was there, a smug look on his face. Silas stopped. He gently set down the sack of flour and the other supplies. He didn't look at Fletcher. He looked at Alara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar hunted look he thought he'd banished. He saw the terror of the cage returning. "This ain't your business, Fletcher," Silas said, his voice low and even. "Get out of our way." Fletcher laughed, a high, unpleasant sound. He brandished a piece of paper. "Oh, but it is my business. This here is a bill of sale, duly signed. This thing," he said, jabbing a finger toward Alara, "is my property, and I've come to collect what's mine." He took a step forward and made the mistake of grabbing Alara's arm. It was the spark that lit the fuse. Everything in Silas that he had kept locked down, his vow of non-involvement, his desire to just be left alone, it all evaporated in a single, silent instant. He moved. He stepped directly between Fletcher and Alara, breaking the man's grip with a flick of his wrist. He was a mountain come to life. He looked at Fletcher, and for the first time, the ringmaster saw something in Silas's eyes that truly scared him. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, something final. "No," Silas said. The word was not a plea or a warning. It was a verdict. Fletcher, emboldened by his audience and his hired help, scoffed. "Get her," he snarled at his men. The 2 roustabouts moved in. They were big men, used to winning fights through sheer size. They were not prepared for Silas. The first one threw a clumsy punch. Silas didn't even seem to move his feet. He just shifted his weight, let the punch slide past his head, and delivered a short, brutal jab to the man's gut. The roustabout folded in on himself with a gasp, all the fight gone out of him. The second man hesitated, seeing his partner on the ground. He came at Silas more cautiously, trying to grapple him. It was like trying to wrestle an oak tree. Silas simply planted his feet, absorbed the man's momentum, and then shoved. It was a movement of pure explosive power. The man flew backward, stumbling over his own feet and landing hard in the dust. The whole thing took less than 5 seconds. It wasn't a fight. It was a removal of obstacles. Now it was just Silas and Fletcher. The ringmaster's face had gone slack with shock and fear. The crowd was dead silent. Silas walked toward him, his steps heavy and deliberate. He held out his hand, not in a threat, just an open palm. Fletcher, trembling, understood. He placed the bill of sale into Silas's hand. Silas didn't even glance at it. He held it up for the crowd to see, this flimsy piece of paper that had been her cage. Then with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it in half, then in quarters, then into tiny, meaningless scraps. He opened his hand and let the pieces flutter down into the dust of the street, like bitter confetti. He looked at Fletcher, then his eyes swept over the silent, watching faces of the townsfolk, his gaze lingering for a moment on Henderson. He had made no speech. He had issued no grand challenge, but his message was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. She is not a thing. She is with me. This is the only warning you will get. He turned his back on them all, bent down to retrieve the sack of flour, and started walking. After a moment, Ilara fell into step beside him, leaving the town, the whispers, and the torn scraps of her past behind them. They walked back to the cabin in a profound silence. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that stretched out before them. The air was different now. The confrontation in town hadn't just been a fight. It had been a declaration. He had drawn a line in the dust not just for the town or for Fletcher, but for her. He had stood in front of her, a shield, a wall. When they got back to the cabin, the familiar quiet felt charged with a new kind of energy. He built up the fire, the flames licking at the logs, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. She sat in her usual chair, but she wasn't just watching the fire tonight. She was watching him. She watched him move, the quiet power in his frame, the way he stoked the flames with a gentle, deliberate hand. He had been violent for her. He, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had stepped into the center of the world's ugliness on her behalf. The wall he had built around himself had been breached, not by an enemy, but by his own choice to protect her. She knew she had to breach her own. The silence she had worn like armor for so long suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. It was time to take it off. She waited until he was settled in his own chair, staring into the flames as he always did, lost in his own world of memory and grief. "They had a name for me," she said, her voice soft but clear in the crackling quiet. "At the circus, Fletcher gave it to me." Silas didn't turn, but she knew he was listening. Every line of his body was attuned to her voice. "He called me Goliath Girl. The crowd, they just called me Goliath, or sometimes the Stilt, or just Freak." She said the names out loud, letting them hang in the air for a moment before letting them go, like releasing captive birds. They were just names for a thing in a cage, something to be looked at. She took a deep, shuddering breath. This was the hardest part, the part she had never told anyone, not even herself, really. Before that, before the circus, when the man who sold me was still just my stepfather, he would get angry. At my height, at the cost of my shoes. He said I was a curse, a punishment from God. He told everyone I was simple, that I couldn't learn, that I was big and dumb, like an ox. The words came out in a steady, quiet rush, a confession whispered to the fire. It was the whole unvarnished truth of her life. The layers of shame and humiliation peeled back one by one. The story of how she had been systematically unmade, turned from a person into an object, a spectacle, a problem. "I started to believe him," she whispered. "It was easier to be silent. If you don't talk, they can't call you dumb. If you're just a thing, the hurt, it doesn't feel like it's happening to a person. It's just happening." She fell silent. The confession was over. The whole ugly story was laid bare in the small, warm space between them. She waited, her heart pounding, waited for him to say something, to shift uncomfortably, to dismiss it, to do anything. For a long time, he did nothing. He just stared into the fire. Then he slowly turned his head and looked at her. Really looked at her. His gray eyes were not filled with pity. They were filled with a deep, quiet gravity, a profound understanding. He had his graves on the hill. She had hers in her memory. They were both survivors of different kinds of apocalypses. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement of her truth. He accepted it, all of it. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she could barely identify it. It was trust, raw and absolute. "That's not my name," she said, her voice stronger now. "The names they gave me, they're not mine." He waited. "My real father, the one who died. He gave me a name." She looked him straight in the eye, a directness she had never dared before. "My name is Alara." The name, her name. It felt strange and powerful on her tongue. A forgotten treasure, unearthed. Silas held her gaze. He let the name settle in the room. He tasted it. He let it replace all the other, uglier names. Then his voice, low and rough but surprisingly gentle, he said it back to her. Ilara. It was the first time he had ever said her name. And in the way he said it, it was not just a name. It was a recognition, a validation, a welcome home. The next morning, something had fundamentally shifted. The name Alara hung in the air of the cabin, making it hers as much as his. When Silas left for the day, he didn't just grunt a farewell. He paused at the door. "Ilara," he said, just the name, a quiet acknowledgement. She nodded, and the small gesture felt like a conversation. A new foundation was being laid. That afternoon, she saw him not in the woods or by the fences, but in the small, fallow garden plot behind the cabin. It was a sad-looking patch of earth, overgrown with weeds and littered with stones. It was the place his wife had once tended, a place he hadn't touched since he dug the 3 graves on the hill just beyond it. He was turning the soil with a heavy spade, his powerful back bent to the task. The work was slow, arduous. He was clearing away the dead things, preparing the ground for something new. Ilara came out and stood at the edge of the plot, watching him. He was not just turning dirt, he was confronting his own ghosts. He was letting life back into a place that had only held death for him. He saw her watching and straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He walked over to a nearby stump where his coat was lying and pulled a small, folded cloth packet from the pocket. He held it out to her. "She liked flowers," he said, his voice quiet. "Sunflowers. Said they were the only thing stubborn enough to grow in this dirt." Ilara took the packet. It was heavy with the promise of life. She unfolded the cloth carefully. Inside were dozens of large striped seeds. The seeds of a flower known for its height, for its resilience, for turning its face always toward the light. He gestured to the newly turned earth. "Ground's ready," he said. It was an invitation. More than that, it was a transfer of trust. He was letting her plant hope in the soil of his sorrow. She walked onto the prepared ground. The earth was soft and dark under her bare feet. She knelt down, her long frame folding gracefully, and took one of the seeds from the packet. She looked at the small, striped seed in her palm. It was so small, yet it held the blueprint for a giant, a living thing that would reach for the sky without apology. With her long finger, she pushed a deep hole into the soil and dropped the seed in. She covered it gently, patting the earth down with a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. She was planting a seed, but it felt like she was planting a part of herself, a part that was ready to grow again. Silas watched her. Then he picked up his spade and began working another section of the plot, preparing more ground. She took another seed and planted it, and another. They worked in comfortable silence, 2 figures under a wide-open sky. Him, the strong man, breaking the hard ground. Her, the tall woman, planting the seeds of the future. They weren't just making a garden. They were building a home. They were 2 broken things. A man who had lost everything and a woman who had never been allowed to be anything, finding a way to grow again, together, stubbornly, reaching for the sun. If you enjoyed this story, please give the video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content just like this. Thank you for watching.